Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on the American Revolution and the Enlightenment. In today's lecture and the activity, so you guys are going to listen to this lecture and then read a couple of articles and then answer this actual question. We are going to look at to what extent the American Revolution was driven by Enlightenment ideas, or how did the Enlightenment affect the American Revolution. So one thing you want to think of before we get started is that do now. Define liberty. What is liberty? What does it truly mean? All right. Let's kind of set the stage. So, in looking at Britain's 13 colonies in North America, you have to go back to the early 1600s with their first official and permanent colony in Jamestown. And from there, you start to see various colonies progress. And then the final of the 13 comes in the form of Georgia in 1732. Now, for the most part, the colonists in America at this time, or in the 13 colonies, they had a very high degree of autonomy. They had freedom of control. They actually did have independence from Great Britain, even if it was de facto independence, because of where they were located. You had basically a 2-week journey by sea before anything from Britain could get there. So they, for all intents and purposes, were fairly independent. Now, the governors of each of the colonies was appointed by the kings, but the colonies actually had their own legislatures. Like, for example, Virginia had the House of Burgesses and so forth, and they had their own court system. So there was a lot of independence there. And voting was pretty much wide open as long as you're a white man and had property. All right, so now what really kind of changes the feelings and the scope of this and really sets forth America, or the 13 colonies, towards revolution is the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War is what it's also known as. And you see these large holdings between Britain and France, and those rivalries that developed during the Age of Exploration and for a variety of other reasons come to the forefront. And Britain is trying to limit French trade interests in North America, and France is trying to gain a better foothold and all this other stuff. And as this is going on, the British decide they're going to build stronger ties with the Iroquois Confederation and start constructing forts along the edges of French territory, such as in places that we consider like Pittsburgh today and so forth, in the Ohio Valley. That's really where you're going to have these tensions kind of arise. And you see various skirmishes and so forth that take place in the middle part of the 1750s, especially involving George Washington at Fort Necessity near present-day Pittsburgh, which really kind of sparks off the war. And Britain officially declares war in 1756, and this is where you get the title of 7 Years' War, even though the conflict itself actually takes place for 9 years. And in reality, in some ways, this was actually a conflict that was a global war. It was the first true world war in some ways, because you have conflicts that are a part of all of these instances and rivalries take place not just in North America, which is the French and Indian War for that part, but also in South America, in Africa, along the sea specifically, but mainly in Europe and in Asia as well. Excuse me. Now, Britain, they're going to be able to win this war. And you can see on the map what they actually gain. They're going to gain all the territory to the Mississippi River. And this is going to be important because it's not only going to give them more influence within the Americas, but because of the eviction of the French from North America and in India, and as part of another part of this, the 7 Years' War, because remember, it's more global, Britain starts to have to actually pay for what happens to them in the war, or the cost of the war, excuse me, and they are almost bankrupt. So they also have no way to administer all these new lands that are brought into their colony in the Americas, and that costs money. That takes a lot to deal with. So you start to see taxes that are going to be instituted by the crown on the American colonists. And there's going to be this resentment that takes place because of this taxation. And Britain wants the money, saying, hey, look, we protected you from this French threat. You're part of our realm of influence. You need to pay these taxes just like everybody else. Now, here's this timeline. I actually would like you guys to stop this for a little bit and kind of view what's going on. So, here's the road to revolution. You see the end of the French and Indian War at the beginning. And then you see these various actions by the British that actually lead to unrest and resentment by the colonists. In particular, you have the Stamp Act, which was passed in 1765, where you see wide resistance to it, where you're basically everything that had to have a stamp, from anything traditional to even something as simple as playing cards, were being taxed. And this was where this idea of no taxation without representation actually really comes from. And there was so much resistance to it, they actually had to withdraw this act the year later. But what they're going to do is they're going to pass other acts to actually supplement this a little bit later on. Then you have other instances like the famous Boston Massacre, which provides more resentment specifically in the North, which is where you're seeing a lot of the issues actually take place because of the trading and all that stuff that's going on in port cities like Boston and New York. And then in 1773, you see the Tea Act. That kind of is, again, something that actually supplements what was happening with the Stamp Act, and in form was a punishment to what was going on in Boston with smugglers like John Hancock and so forth. This actually leads to the Boston Tea Party. And then after that, you're going to see other measures taken by the British that lead to more, they're more just basically punishable measures. And what the colonists end up doing is they organize the First Continental Congress. And this is a step towards revolution, but it's important because it actually is an organizational setup for them to say, hey, look, these are our problems. Can we work together? And the First Continental Congress is not an act of trying to determine independence. It's an act of trying to rectify the situation and work together with the crown. Now, ultimately, what ends up happening is this isn't necessarily successful in its full goals, and you see the colonists and British start to fight in Massachusetts, specifically starting with the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. And from there, you have the Second Continental Congress. You see they authorize the draft of a Declaration of Independence, and there's a Continental Army under the command of George Washington, and the revolution actually breaks out even before we declare independence on July 4th of 1776. All right, so the Declaration you guys are going to read and read in this unit, and you've read a little bit already. It's authored primarily by Thomas Jefferson, although he's not the one that totally wrote it. He had other people that helped him. But there's some key important things that you need to know about this document, because in terms of, specifically in terms of linking it towards the Enlightenment. First off, the famous line of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a steal on John Locke's inalienable or natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Property was changed to pursuit of happiness because one of the reasons is because of the question going on with slavery in the United States. Or, sorry, the colonies. It's not the United States yet. And then two, you have equality, the idea of all men are created equal. That's a principle, a very, very big principle of the Enlightenment. And then also the consent of the governed. That's something that's being pushed by people like John Locke and several others of the Enlightenment thinkers. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Governments only exist and get their powers by the consent of the people. The other two are limitations of government power, so making sure there's structures on them. So the history of looking at the King of England and all these repeated usurpations of power or over-exercising their power, and these punishment acts are something that are saying, hey, look, you can't do this. And also the idea of the right to revolt. If a government keeps going against you, you have the right as an individual to throw off that government or overthrow that government. And that's a very important key part that's mentioned by several of the Enlightenment thinkers. Now, part of the reason why all this is tied in is not just because of Jefferson, but the other men as well were linked closely, and seeing the people that they learned from were these Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Bacon and Newton. But Thomas Jefferson's the main author, so there's no coincidence why all this stuff is specifically in there. Because he said they were the greatest men that ever lived without any exception. So why wouldn't you pay homage to them and view what they said as something that was very important? Now, there's something that's important here, and I kind of already mentioned it, with the idea of pursuit of happiness and property. When you read the Declaration of Independence, even though it says all men are created equal and all this stuff, there is no mention of the rights of enslaved people, women, or natives. Okay, and that's something that's very important to consider, especially since we're talking about nationalism and political revolutions as we move through Unit 5. All right, now, unfortunately, because of the setup of how everything was going and the views of people like Jefferson and many others that viewed that there shouldn't be a strong central government, the US government or the American government is very weak. It doesn't have a lot of control. And more powers actually go to the states. And it's actually a disaster. There's no taxation power, there's no executive branch, there's really only a legislative branch that's working within it. And the judicial branch is more left up to the states themselves. There's too much autonomy among the states. And when you have rivalries that get between them and regionally and all that stuff, it causes so many problems. So the US in its early days is facing all these numerous crises, and they need more central power, they need a better economy, they need a better control, and so forth. But what ends up happening is in 1787, the 13 states, I think it's 12 of them, come together and actually agree to authorize a convention to amend their existing plan for their government, which is the Articles of Confederation. And they decide as they're going through it that their plan is terrible and they have to scrap it, and they decide to write a new plan. Now, if you guys actually go back and look at the Articles of Confederation, they do borrow parts from it, but they borrow the best parts and mix it in. And that's what leads to the Constitution. Now, one of the key players here that you need to know in the development of the Constitution and so forth after the American Revolution is James Madison. And again, he was somebody that was deeply influenced by the men of the Enlightenment, specifically John Locke, We the People of the United States, all that kind of stuff. You can read this on screen. This shows a connection. It's about the consent of the governed. Another person he was very well linked to and looked at was Baron de Montesquieu, and the ideas of separation of powers and checks and balances were a key part that were put into the Constitution by people like James Madison to make a stronger national government and allow for our government to be flexible and to kind of fix those issues that we had under the Articles of Confederation. All right, so the three branches of government that are developed, as you guys know, are the executive branch, which is indirectly elected by the people. So it sets terms, they set the terms of office. Okay, there's the electoral college, popular vote. The electoral college is the indirect. You have the legislative branch. Now, at the beginning, the only people that are directed, only part of it that are directly elected by the people are the House of Representatives, and then from there, the Senate is actually elected by the House of Representatives in the states. And then the judicial branch, it's not democratic. You have a selection that's put forth by the president, and then you have senatorial consent on those. And that still exists to this day. And we've had some changes in terms of adding a popular vote, which didn't exist at the beginning, and then also an amendment coming in and electing the Senate. And you have to understand here that democracy is superseded by the Republican ideology that people voted for elected representatives. And that's who they only voted for. They only voted for the representatives, and then the representatives took over. Again, it's a representative democracy. Oops. Now, here, I want you guys to take a look at it. This is the separation of powers based on Montesquieu's plan, and this is what we basically developed. No one branch has unchecked power. They have pretty much, there's a check on them in some form from the others, whether it's minimal or more strict, depending on what it is. And you can take a look at what those examples are. You have each branch has some way to halt the action of others. Okay, that's that check, that no unchecked power, and that government cannot be fast and efficient. They had that view that by nature, things had to be slow. And as much as that may be frustrating at times, these checks and balances are there to make sure that things stay together, make sure that one branch doesn't have too much power, and then also make sure that everything's being done in the best way possible, even if it's not efficient or fast. Last slide. The last thing that you need to understand too is, even though we're not talking about the revolution anymore, the revolution in a sense in history actually extends itself out in the early period of America. And you need to know that. is that the influence of the Enlightenment is huge, not just in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, but in the Bill of Rights, in those first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which come in a couple years later. And they're modeled off of the Enlightenment thinkers and the English Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta. And you can see them there if you go back and look at the English Bill of Rights, the Magna Carta. You can see the influences. But here you can see the influences of Voltaire in terms of the First Amendment and the freedom of speech, and Rousseau in looking at the Third and Fourth Amendments and needing probable cause and warrants and not putting soldiers in homes when it's a peaceful time, or in Beccaриa's ideas when you look at the Seventh and Eighth Amendments and the idea of trial by jury and the appropriate charges and bail set and all that kind of stuff. There's huge amounts of influences from the Enlightenment in other documents of the period. All right, guys, that's all I have for you. Again, make sure that you guys view this lecture, take notes on it, read those couple of articles that are linked in, and answer the questions that are appropriate to this lesson. Have a good one.